Hello, everybody. It's great to have Will Samson here with us today. Will, thank you for making the time to be interviewed on the channel.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. This is exciting.
I appreciate it. So can you tell us, Will, where are you from originally, and are you living in the same place now?
Originally, I am from the northeastern part of the U.S., from New
Mhm.
Jersey, but I always conditioned that statement with the fact that I've lived my entire adult life in the American South. So I'm very much a product of the American South and kind of that way of thinking and even that way of sort of living. Yeah, and right now I'm in the Washington D.C. area. We're in
Okay.
Ashburn, Virginia, about 30 minutes west of D.C. So I haven't always lived here. I've lived a few places. I actually spent a good bit of time in Kentucky, which is where I did my doctoral work.
Mhm.
But we moved back here 4 years ago. My wife is from here, and we really love this area.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me ask, what led you to doing what you do now? Did you always want to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, actually, so it's a fun story. So I was an entrepreneur, had
Mhm.
a company for a number of years called Smart Ministry, where we helped mostly religious nonprofits, but nonprofits of
Mhm.
any kind, where we aggregated services into a portal and provided everything from member management to to emails and messaging and video content and all that. The problem was that we were really early, and so
Okay.
we were trying to explain to people. This was sort of the late '90s, early 2000s. We were trying to
Mhm.
explain to people this idea that you could aggregate services together into this portal. I don't know that we would have described ourselves as a software as a service kind of a business, but that's certainly what we were doing.
Sure.
And we were taking advantage of a lot of the emerging technologies around the internet and really what has come to be called web services. The problem was that we were really early out there,
Sure.
and we were also trying to describe the value of this service to organizations that often were small and didn't
Mhm.
really quite know what to do with what we were offering to help them. And so that was a great learning experience, but it
Mhm.
also did not come to a good final end. We ended up
I, I
closing
I understand.
after
Sure. They.
after 3 years.
I
And
understand.
and it was then that I went back into it, and I had that was a company I had really built from scratch, and literally written from scratch. So I had written every line of code for the
Okay.
interface, and so it was a chance to get back into the software space, but also into project management. And so I started managing large projects, and the way we manage things in the corporate world is often quite quite bad.
Sure.
In fact, I tell a story. I was managing a large program for a nonprofit in DC. It was a software program, and I got so tired of all the meetings we had that I actually
Mhm.
I had the janitor come in and take all the chairs out of the conference room because I thought, well, maybe if there was nowhere to sit, that
Sure.
my people wouldn't end up having these just hours long meetings.
Right.
And
Did they buy bean bags?
yeah, and I didn't buy them beanbags. No, I didn't buy them
Sure.
beanbags. We took the chairs out, and a couple days later, I came around the corner, and there was about four of them sitting in the hallway having an impromptu meeting, almost like they were sticking it to the man by having a meeting.
Right.
And I remember asking the guy who had helped me move the chairs. I said, what's going on? Like, he said, you know what? People have to want to change. And that's
Sure.
actually how I got into change management,
Mhm.
which is a lot of what I do now. And so I spent some years in change management. I actually also went and did some academic work. I went and got a PhD in sociology and worked in the academy for a
Mhm.
little while, but got back into change management because I believe that we can really help people have a more effective workday. And if they have a more effective workday, that's just going to make their life better. And so Ready to Grow, my current venture, is really built around that idea. How do we kind of make people's lives more meaningful? Because the reality is we're going to spend a third of our life at work regardless.
I understand. So, Will, your current business is called Ready to Grow, and when did you start that?
So that is quite new. I started that in August of this year, after I had a business that started right as the pandemic was hitting. So there was
Sure.
a friend of mine who was also an entrepreneur who had a very interesting, innovative coaching model, but it was a coaching model for individuals.
Mhm.
And he came to me and said, could we bring this to corporations? And I said, I think so. I think that'd be great. And we got revved up and ready to go. And then the pandemic hit. And so
I understand.
we had some good success and we did some interesting work, but it was just really difficult. I think companies, and especially at the time, we were working with a lot of small businesses, and they didn't, it was a difficult time for them and a difficult transition. We were able to do some really fun work around teamwork, but it was more of a lessons learned time than a great growth time. And so I started Ready to Grow in August as a way of really incorporating a lot of the lessons that I learned during the pandemic and bringing them to companies.
I understand. So, who's your primary client? Is it corporations, or are you still working with nonprofits?
It's corporations. Yeah. No, I work
Okay.
right now exclusively with corporations. We're talking to a couple government agencies, but our work right now is exclusively with corporations. Yeah, I think there's innovation to be found everywhere. Maybe the most obvious work for us right now is in the corporate space, because they can, the large, particularly the medium to large corporations,
Okay.
they
Do you find that
recognize what's that?
do you find that corporations like people, some are more resistant to change than others?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And corporations have a culture, and corporations have a culture. We describe. We don't talk much about organizations, even though we are formally organizational change managers.
Mhm.
We talk about ecosystems. So corporations have ecosystems, and our job is really to come in as cultivators and tillers and gardeners to
Mhm.
make that ecosystem more vibrant.
Sure.
Um,
So I'm very interested, Will, before you actually get in the front door of a corporation, I think for most business owners that have ideas like yours, where they really want to do good and they really want to improve people's lives in a particular way. But the reality of business is that you got to get in the door before you're able to make that change. So what does that look like, practically speaking, for you on the sales and marketing side, if you don't mind me asking, to
yeah.
actually get invited to be in a corporation to be able to help out with change, which by human nature seems to be something that people are pretty resistant to do.
They are. Yeah. We've gone through that process even ourselves. So for us, the way in the door is with very practical help. And so our end game is to really help shape corporate culture,
Mhm.
but often that starts with helping shape the daily activities of a corporation, and
Okay.
even walking through change projects. So we do work right now. My largest client is a international organization that does a lot of standards and testing, and the work we're doing with them is very much around improving communication processes,
Mhm.
making sure that they understand how to measure change impacts, things like that. And so we do a lot of really practical work, because it's that practical work that gives us the foundation and the credibility to then begin to work with some of the bigger questions around culture, leadership, even how we think about management. We have to really gain the credibility to raise those questions within an organization.
Does what you do really change depending on the industry or the type of organization that you're working with? Or is there just some common principles that you find apply across the board?
Yes.
Okay.
Both and. Because of my background and the partners I work with, we tend to do a lot of work in software settings because it's what we know. And it's also true that software changes are a little clearer to help people navigate. So you used to use this human resource management software, and now use that human resource management software. And the path forward is usually pretty direct. And so it is true that there's, we tend to do a lot of work in the software industry because that's where change is more clearly understood. But I will say that that one of our current clients and the biggest client we're working with, we're doing a lot of work with financial services. And so that requires us to really kind of step back a little bit and say, what are some of the first things? What are some of the basic principles of change management, and how do we apply them? And so it's always a both and. And I've got a client right now who's a real estate firm, a small real estate firm, and so that's not necessarily software related. And so there are these basic principles that we can bring, and concepts around change that we can bring. But we do tend to work, a lot of our work is with software because it's what we know.
Sure.
It's our background.
So on the client side, do you find that people come to you and they're looking for help with a particular problem, whether that's too many meetings or that's a toxic work environment, or do they look to you for some recommendations?
Yeah, no, it's often because they've identified a particular problem, and often because they have a particular issue that they're trying to address, or there's something happening in either their environment or their leadership that requires working with us, or requires navigating through some tough times. So a lot of my work has been in the mergers and acquisition space, and so a couple of years ago, I helped a large defense contractor navigate the acquisition of another large defense contractor. I did the IT portion of that acquisition, and that's a very specific problem, and yet it raises all kinds of questions about organization, leadership, culture, even and certainly processes. What processes do you go through on a daily basis? It's interesting. It's always interesting to folks. We come in and because we bring somewhat of a technical background, we also bring a lot of process mapping and things like that. So we sort of help people say, okay, what do you actually do? Talk to me about your day. Tell me what your day looks like. And we help them understand how they spend their day and what processes they go through. And that ends up bringing some insight as well. So we come in often to solve a particular problem. We're going to buy this other company, and we need all of our software to be integrated. That's a particular problem, an identified issue. But then we get to work on a lot of the other issues because we're there.
Okay. So do you find that you're working mostly with management, or with those being managed, or a bit of both?
It's a bit of both. We our initial interface is with management, without a doubt. We're always brought in by the leadership. But we are also a very user-focused group. And so, in change management, there's really kind of two schools of thought. And one is the more dominant thought, what's often called the ProSci model, just because a company called ProSci developed it, which is a user-based sort of bottom-up approach. And then there's John Kotter at Harvard, who talks about the top-down, very leadership-oriented change management approach. And for us, it's a both and. You've got to get leadership can help create a culture, but if people aren't following, then they're not really necessarily leading on the change. And so we find that it's important to pay attention to what management is trying to create, but it's really important to listen well to the end user, whatever that end, however we define the end user, it's important to listen to them, because their voice and their conception of what's happening in their environment is really what's going to shape the success of the change project.
I understand. So you mentioned that you have a PhD, and you were involved in the academy. I could imagine in your field it must be widely cross-discipline. I could imagine that sociology and psychology and management studies and others must all kind of have a voice. How do you learn to do what you do?
I followed what I love. That's how I learned to do what I do. And really the reason I was driven toward my work in sociology was because I recognized that interdependence is absolutely critical. It's critical for me as an individual. It's critical for teams. We're in this kind of interesting time where as a culture globally, we've seen all of this great work being done on individual human potential. And so I think about like Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, rather. The work on flow by this psychologist whose name I can never pronounce, but just
me either. Yeah, starts with the M and last name is with the C, but yes.
So there's all this great work on individual human potential, and yet we're still seeing some of the same problems. People are trying to figure out how to be better, how to achieve more, and achieving more. For me is figuring out how to work together with others for common goal, whether that's the social enterprises that I help work on, or whether that's my corporate clients. And so, yeah, you're right. I rely heavily on a lot of what's being done in human psychology and motivated behavior. We do a lot of work with what actually motivates people to do what they do, which is psychology. But then we also bring in sociology, and we bring in a lot of some innovative tools. We work with a firm out of Holland that has a tool called the AEM Cube that is just a way of looking at what is your best and most natural contribution to the team. So we're always thinking team and group, which gives us maybe a unique way of looking at some of these problems. And the reason why I've been able to do that is because I just keep pursuing things I'm interested in and want to find out more about. And that's given me that cross-disciplinary look.
I understand. So a lot of what you do, it sounds like there's been a lot of research out there, over the decades to be able to read from. But at the same time, you started this business during a pretty rare time. I won't say unprecedented, but almost unprecedented, time during a global pandemic. What do you feel that we've learned about leadership during a global pandemic?
Well, the old maxim is that the way you know you're leading is if people are following you, and I think that's still true, but that's not necessarily. That's a very one-sided model. And we've often had this, seems to me, false dichotomy between, are we representing the user, or are we representing leadership, for example, management or worker. What I've learned in my work, and what I've learned with some of the tools that I'm using in some of the research, is that what really matters is that people feel they're able to bring their best contribution to the effort, whatever that is. And so one of the things that we work with our clients help our clients move toward, is from leadership to contributorship, which is a term we've coined. It's not exactly the best term for it yet, but the idea is that what's your best contribution, and how does that come together to make your efforts successful? Because one of the things we learned from this overall pandemic was that workers have a lot more power than they realized. And so, we're seeing a lot of problems and a lot of inability to fill jobs in the market. And it's because as we've given people a greater voice, which we've done through technology and a whole variety of other things, they want to bring their best contribution to the effort. And so this idea of the the strong leader, the out front leader. I think it's still true. I think I don't think the need for leadership has gone away, but I think we have to begin to recast our ideas of leadership and really think about what creates a better system, what creates that healthier ecosystem, not who's the alpha person in front, who is, guiding the path.
Sure. Others seem to talk about different models of leadership, and at times I wonder if, those might be personality based. Some people might be more of the alpha leader, others might be more of a coach or, mentor. Do you think there's some validity to that theory that there's different models of leadership? And if so, do you think that is driven by, who leaders might be as individuals?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. And so oftentimes we base our ideas about leadership on two things, personality and history. And those are okay, but they can sometimes deceive us. And so, personality often, we see these organizations that were very much shaped by an individual's personality. Apple Computer, Salesforce.com. I mean, we see these companies that are very much shaped by an individual's personality and can take on the dysfunctions or the beauty of that individual's personality. And so Salesforce.com is a great example. That was a company that was really kind of built up to be very service oriented, and
Sure.
They were, I believe, I'm right in saying that they were the first company to have a person at the CXO level whose responsibility was to make sure that they were a socially responsible company, that they were really, active and engaged in making the world a better place. So it is true that personality can drive it, but we're moving from the pyramid to the network. And so
Sure.
The pyramid, this idea that there was someone above other people and everything, went down in terms of authority, in terms of ability, in terms of contribution and all that. That's a very old model.
Sure.
It doesn't serve us well. What serves us better is the idea of a networked world where we have these interconnected resources, and we have more or less density, more or less connection to those resources. And so, that's going to require us to constantly be rethinking our model, constantly be asking, what's the best use of this particular group of people for this particular effort in this particular time? And that requires us to think more as design thinkers than as project managers. So
I understand.
when we learned project management, it was all about time, money, scope, and money, and we had a certain set of tasks that we put into a spreadsheet or a project document, whatever. But design thinking is the kind of flexibility that we're going to need for solving today's problems.
Sure. And I guess we've even seen that in project management, going from waterfall project management methodology to more of an agile methodology, or at least something of a combination between those. But it's interesting for me to hear what you're saying about going from more of a pyramid or a top-down model of leadership to more of a network type model. And how long do you think in reality it's going to take for most companies or organizations to be able to make that list? I think that what you're talking about might be pretty forward thinking still, in 2021 for a lot of people now, and I think culture, including corporate cultures, are pretty resistant to change. So, what do you think is realistic for corporations that you work with and, others out there to be able to make these changes? Is that a quick change or something that's going to take a long time?
Oh, long time. Yeah. That the last part of your question is the easiest one to answer, which is it's going to take a really long time. I sometimes compare it to, the Star Wars films where the dark force is strong, like the
Mhm.
pull back into this way of thinking
Sure.
is very strong. Because even, I had a client, a large defense contractor, and I was working with the project management folks, and they started
Mhm.
talking about this agile framework that they had created. And the further I got into it, the more I realized they had just basically taken a waterfall model and pasted, like, it was almost like they had taken like sticky notes and put the word agile over top
Right.
of everything.
Sure.
So the pull backwards to the pull back to that particular way of thinking is very strong, but it's we should question it, if nothing else, because that's what the data tells us to do. So
Sure.
90% of companies fail to actually execute their core mission 100%. 70% of projects fail on some level. The last year we counted, which was 4 years ago, 17% of our corporate projects failed so badly that they presented an existential threat to the company. The company had to
Wow.
actually shut down. Yeah, it's going to take some time, but I also think that culture always shows up. And that's what
Sure.
we're seeing. Like when we see these companies that are having difficulty filling roles, filling jobs, culture didn't go to sleep. Culture was still there, and
Right.
culture showed up, regardless of how they wanted to respond to these cultural changes.
Sure. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I think that's one of the changes during this pandemic. If we could stick with that change theme there, it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm wrong often, but it seems that as resistant as human beings are to change, sometimes things like the pandemic or a pandemic or something that is traumatic or prolonged can bring about some change that may or may not be lasting once it's over. But do you see some things during this pandemic? For example, you mentioned what I think commonly known as the Great Resignation, where
Yeah.
people are leaving. Tell us more about that and other things that you see that the pandemic may have changed with work culture, either temporarily or permanently.
Yeah, yeah, and we have two examples we can look at historically. So we've had a global pandemic before it happened in 1917, and we had a global upheaval in World War II, and so we sort of have two examples we can look at. After World War II, at least the United States, and really and Western Europe, but globally, we all kind of pulled together, and there was this significant improvement in life. I'm not naive enough to believe that it was nirvana in the 50s and 60s, but there was some really interesting innovation, and particularly in human rights. I mean, after World War II is when we had significant changes to, at least in the American context, to civil rights and things like that. So there were some very positive things that happened as a result of a global upheaval. After 1917, we had the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression.
Hmm.
So the point is, like, we can go either way. It's going to go either way, and it really is up to us. The question is, what are we going to do with what happened?
Sure.
So right now we are seeing, this Great Resignation. We're seeing, we're seeing people who are expressing their disinterest in being a part of a culture that has kept them disconnected from their work, that has
Hmm.
kept them unable to contribute, that has created a stratified environment. And often for people like myself who may spend some time thinking about issues of social justice, it's easy to fall into terms like fair and just and things like that.
Sure.
That's true. But I think what's more true is we're seeing just a fundamental threat to our economies and to our
Hmm.
survival. It
Sure.
hasn't quite gotten to a species survival level, but it's on its way toward that. The reality is that we've created systems that are unsustainable. And so even if just for pure economic growth, I think we're going to begin to rethink some of these things. And then to bring it back to the entrepreneurial mindset, boy, entrepreneurs who can begin to understand this and begin to solve some of these problems that get people reconnected with their life, they create more vibrant communities, and communities of the future too. I think,
Mhm.
it's tempting for us, regardless across the political spectrum, to look at the past and think there's something we can go back and get and reclaim.
Sure.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's true. I think what is true is that we understand more about the human individual than we ever did before.
Mhm.
And so the great entrepreneurial opportunities are going to be not so much in maximizing that individual human, but in figuring out how we together can create new opportunities.
Sure, sure. Very helpful. Do you think that people will wind up going back to work after the pandemic's over, same as before? Or do you think people will seem to follow, this trend of wanting to work from home moving forward?
Yeah. And that's where I think the answer depends on what what corporate leaders globally, I should say, have learned. And so one of the questions I get asked a lot, and one of the questions I see a lot in conversations on places like LinkedIn, is how should we compensate our people if they work at home?
Hmm.
That's become a really big question. I've got a friend who runs a staffing agency here in the DC area who's asking that question. Should we compensate people differently if they live in, if they live not in the area, and if they live in a place that has a lower cost of living? And to me, that's the absolutely wrong way to approach the question. To me, what's the value they bring? And that value, including what are they not costing you by no longer having an office, things like that. And so I think that the innovative companies will be the companies that understand that they need to think about how they incentivize their individuals, their team members, their contributors to bring their best contribution to the effort, and not, am I paying them less because they live in El Paso versus Austin? And
Sure.
it's just such a short-sighted way to look at that question. And so the answer to your question is, what will people do? Well, it'll depend on where they choose to work. I think those who are entrepreneurial will recognize, like I think about Dan Price, who runs Gravity Systems up in Seattle, has gone to 100% virtual because he realized that's, his team is most successful when they have the kind of quality of life that allows them to be fully present at work and then to be wherever else they need to be. And that has the potential to really shape all of our work-life culture. But the answer to your question about what people are going to do is really going to be whether people take advantage of this shift in culture that has already or is already in the process of occurring. It's just a question of whether we take advantage of it.
Yes, yes. I think, as an American living in the Philippines,
Right.
and thinking about through some of these same things, one of the companies I have here is a business process outsourcing company where people hire us specifically for the reason that wages are lower here and they're able to get more bandwidth done at a lower cost. So that's probably the only reason why people think to work with us over here. But it's really the same changes that I see here, where a lot of employees really enjoy working from home.
Right.
But I think there's some different channels, some different challenges, culturally. Time is not necessarily quite as literal, in my part of the world as in the US or other places. If some friends of mine here and I all agree to catch up at 6:30 p.m. for dinner, by 7:30 p.m. all of us are mostly
Right.
here, and that does impact work culture to some sense. So I'm really interested to see how some of these things play out, not only in Western context, but really throughout the world, where I think culturally work looks a little bit different than others as well. But let me know for you, Will. We've talked a lot about your business and a lot of change, but I'm really interested to know a bit more about you as an entrepreneur. Can you tell us, what does a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, I, like you, do some work internationally, so
Hmm.
often it starts early in the morning and can go a bit later. My typical day starts with really focusing on the basics of what allows me to be successful as an entrepreneur, which is
Hmm.
tending to myself first. And
Hmm.
so my day starts with exercise, and it starts with spiritual activities. I'm a person in long-term recovery, which I don't
Hmm.
mind sharing with people because I just give a TED talk about that. So,
Sure.
so I spend time doing some recovery work in the morning, and I do some spiritual work. I meditate every morning. That's the kind of basic grounding that I need to
Hmm.
then do everything else that I do during the day.
Sure.
And so, the bulk of my day is spent with client work and helping clients be successful, helping clients do the things they need to do. And then I spend a minimum of an hour a day on opportunity and growth. And so, what I have found as an entrepreneur is it's really easy to get caught up in work, bill,
Hmm.
like what's the thing that's going to make me money. But and maybe it's being an older guy, sort of starting another however many third, fourth venture, in my 50s. But I'm just keenly aware of the need for grounding, and the need for
Sure.
connection. And
Mhm.
so in addition to that spiritual and physical time I spend in the morning, I spend an hour each day growing myself and figuring out how to increase opportunities. And so that could involve reading. So it involves a limited amount of podcasts and social media.
Mhm.
I actually have filters on my social media during the day, so I'm not
Mhm.
sitting around checking Facebook or even LinkedIn for that matter, which is helpful, but it can be a real distraction. And then it's sort of asking what I can do in service to others. And so that's another key part for
Mhm.
me. What it means to be an entrepreneur is not just to not just to start something that's going to make me money, or that's going to create a company. Those are all great goals, but I'm always asking, how can I use what I've been given in service to others?
Yeah, very
So,
helpful.
so then, like, how can I give back, and am I giving back, or is this just something I'm doing because I want to feel good about myself? So
Sure, sure.
yeah.
Yeah, talking about morning routines and investing in yourself and then investing in others throughout the day is really refreshing. To hear. Often when I talk to entrepreneurs, they're thinking about the stuff that truly is important that you have to do
Right.
to get your business done. But I think what you talked about, recharging your batteries, it sounds like by caring for yourself and also caring for others, I think is really a much needed balance to be able to make it for the long haul in entrepreneurial life. So what about the fun side of Will? If you're not working, if you're not helping others and all of these other things, is there anything else that you like to do for fun or to, recharge your batteries that
Yeah.
doesn't involve so much thought?
Sure. I'm a climber. I'm a rock climber. And that to me is just a ton of
Wow.
fun. It's that sort of man against the mountain thing that I really like. It's a challenge, and if you vary your course, then you're always facing new challenges.
Sure.
So that's the one fun thing that I do. And then the other thing is I'm a fairly accomplished home cook, and so I really love to cook. And that
Nice.
the look on somebody's face. Twice in my life, I've had people tell me that something I've prepared, a meal I've prepared for them is the best meal they've ever eaten. I've had that happen twice in my life.
Wow.
So that's those are climbing, food. Those are kind of my when I'm not sitting in this chair trying to create the world. That's what I'm working on.
Very, very cool. So let me ask you, what would you say is your superpower, or the one thing that you feel that you could do extraordinarily well?
Those are almost two questions, but my superpower is, I think, is his vulnerability, which seems ironic. But coming into recovery as I have, and sort of, my life hit a hard spot where I had to really kind of reboot my life. And the way I was able to do that was that I had to learn how to practice interdependence. I had to learn how to practice relying on other people, which to me is interesting because that's all we do all day. None of us live alone, and yet
Sure.
we often have this belief that the world that we are creating the world and we're sort of mastering our own life, when in reality we rely on this network of people and systems that we often don't even begin to understand. So
Sure.
I'm not sure if it's a superpower, but I know what allows me to do what I do is the deep and fundamental belief that I need other people to do it with me.
Well, yeah, quite a bit different perspective than that, Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged kind of, powerful person. Quite the opposite of that. It sounds like what you would say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I appreciate that. So let me ask you a final question here, Will, and you've already just given us, so much to think about. I really appreciate your thoughtful answers. But if there's someone watching today that's an inspiring entrepreneur wanting to start their own business, and they would say, Will, you've done it a few times. How can I make that happen in my own life? What is it that you would tell them about how to get started?
Ask yourself what you want to be different in the world when you leave the world. The old saying, old men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. Ask yourself what kind of shade you want to leave. And I don't mean that in the sort of gangster way. Ask yourself what shade you want to leave, and pursue that. Pursue what wakens your heart. When I do individual coaching, which I don't do that much of these days, but when I do, I always ask, what is it that truly gives you energy? And so, for me, when I would teach, for example, when I was in the college classroom, I would come out almost with a sense of high. And I really was, because neurochemically, because it was something I did well, my brain was being given dopamine for doing it.
Sure.
So ask yourself, how you want the world to be because you were here, and what really wakens you up, and figure out what sits at the intersection of those two, and then just pursue it with everything you got.
Great advice. Great advice. Will, I appreciate your time so much. It's really been a pleasure talking to you and getting your thoughts. If anybody wants to reach out to you, either on social or for business opportunities, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yep. So they can find me at willsamson.com. And then they can find me at Twitter at Twitter and Instagram at the Will Samson.
Great. We'll make sure and leave those links in the bottom in the description. Will, look forward to talking to you, I hope, in the near future. Thanks again for making the time to talk to us.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Take care.
All right.
That time we were sitting on, I can see it in your eyes, you were feeling alive. Well, I tell you what